this is not an algorithm which decides the med school class, right? Everyone who makes these admissions calls and decisions, they are real people.
Alex back for some more MCAT podcasts. This time I get you not just for going over full-length exams, but actually just having a fun conversation this week about kind of what's going to happen in 2022. I can't believe as we're recording this, it's already September 2021. Time flies with this application cycle and every year. So I'm excited to chat with you about kind of what's to come next year. What do you think?
I know. Oh my goodness. I always feel like I feel like in my head it's still like early 2020, and it's like where does the time go? It's disappeared into a time warp.
Time froze when the pandemic started. We all are pretending it's still March of 2020, but unfortunately it is not. We are getting older, and the application cycles to medical school continue on. And right, you're in the middle of an application cycle right now. Previously, we're in another application cycle previously. From your just process, as you went through this, right, you're in the 2021-2022 application cycle, hoping to start medical school in 2022. We'll start with your personal experience. Were there any big changes that you noticed occurred from an application cycle standpoint, whether it's kind of the process of registering for AMCAS or questions they may ask or different parts of a secondary that maybe are new post-pandemic? What was it for you personally before we jump into this kind of big picture stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Because of course, I took my MCAT just before the pandemic. So I guess I was fortunate enough that kind of that part itself wasn't affected. But yeah, so I think the changes to AMCAS and to the application cycle are really interesting because, of course, me, I think like so many other people have had, COVID-related disruptions. I mean, perhaps at its most straightforward, like how are you supposed to, get shadowing experience when hospitals don't allow shadowing because, of course, it's a risk to public health or they don't want you to contract COVID, especially before the vaccines were rolled out. And so, so kind of I think initially the first thing I noticed is in secondaries, all of these prompts that ask you, how was your experience affected by COVID? Yeah. And what I think is super interesting is that every medical school approaches this prompt slightly differently. There are some medical schools which I think effectively are asking you, what experiences did you have planned that were cancelled? Other medical schools would say, Lel, how did COVID affect you personally, right? Maybe asking, instead of just saying like, oh, I was supposed to shadow for this many hours and it didn't happen, instead asking perhaps, what degree of personal disruption did it cause you? And how will that better allow us to contextualize your application?
Yeah.
Then kind of the third type of prompt, which I thought was super interesting, which was, I think of it as like, COVID from 10,000 feet up, which is not necessarily how did COVID impact you personally, but how did COVID impact your conception of the healthcare system or society as a whole?
Yeah. Yeah. I think those are three great buckets to throw it in. And it's very interesting to me what it says about the medical schools based on the question that they are actually answering. To me, I want to go to the schools that are asking how to just affect you and your life, right? Allow me to go, well, my uncle died or my aunt died or my grandfather died, which is true, right? My grandfather died of COVID in April of 2020. And so does that affect did that affect your MCAT? Like, can I line up what you're telling me about personal struggles of family member illnesses or what have you? Or even COVID affected my parents' ability to work, right? And maybe I'm an immigrant and the field that my parents worked in got shut down because they weren't essential workers and whatever. And so now we were more worried about putting food on the table and paying rent than studying for the MCAT. And it, as you mentioned, right, it just really helps contextualize the whole application. And I think schools that ask that question in that specific way really care, or at least they're trying to show that they care, even if they really don't, right?
Versus they're like, they're asking for the information, in a sense, if you don't ask for the story, it can't be considered, right?
Yeah, you can't. Versus the schools that are like, we really just care about how many shadowing hours you have and how much clinical experience you have. And if you don't have enough, tell us if that was affected so that we can really just make sure that the numbers line up, right? It's just like,
Absolutely.
Okay. And then I don't really know how to take the 10,000, 30,000 foot view ones of like, how did it change your perception of the healthcare field or whatever? I'm really trying to understand what the schools are getting out of that, because I think we've seen very early on, there's this huge shift in the perception of healthcare providers during this pandemic. The start of it, right? There are people lining up outside the hospitals, and you're our hero, and thank you, and you're saving us. And now it's like, why are you trying to save us? Like, I don't want your medicines. I want to go take this other thing that Joe Rogan talks about. And now like healthcare providers are villainized for trying to save people. And it's just the weird shift of public perception among a certain subset of people. And I guess I understand why schools will want to see that, but my guess is that if you're still applying to medical school, you still want to be a physician, right? This too shall pass. This kind of craziness that we're in, hopefully this anti-science craziness that we're in, will pass, and medicine will be medicine, and you'll work as a physician. So I don't really understand kind of big picture what they're looking for there. Do you have any thoughts on what do you think they're trying to get out of that question?
Yeah, I think I've kind of mentally tied it into, in fact, you said on on this very podcast, which is, you need to be prepared, for example, for, in an interview setting for a medical school to ask you, what do you think is the most pressing issue that affects US healthcare, delivery today? Or, if you could snap your fingers overnight and change one aspect of the US health system, what would it be?
Yeah.
And I always feel like the quality that they're by proxy looking for there is, are you someone who has broadly considered the structure of healthcare delivery as it is in this country? And are you someone who's able to kind of make a reasoned, considered, and sympathetic analysis and argument for why, what you think is the right course of action is the right course of action. If I had to guess, that kind of view on this COVID prompt is the same thing, which is, this is a generation-defining crisis that intimately involves the US healthcare system. We want medical students who can think thoughtfully and caringly and sympathetically about what that means in the bigger picture, and possibly, prescribe directions or, identify areas of future change.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Well, thanks for that personal kind of take there. Let's talk about the application cycle from 2020 to 2021. Right, 2020 was the pandemic hit March of 2020. Right, mostly is when it affected the U.S., where things kind of shut down. May and June of 2020 is the application cycle that opened up during the pandemic. And we saw all of this news and media hype around the Fauci effect. Do you remember hearing all about the Fauci effect?
I do. I feel like it came in these interesting waves. I feel like the first wave, if you which we don't recommend, is if you perhaps poked around in the pre-med forums of the internet, was this is such a great cycle to apply because people will have been people's journeys would have been disrupted and they wouldn't have applied to medical school, which I mean personally as a take I think is perhaps a little bit immoral. Like oh yeah, it's good for me because all these people won't be able to become doctors. But I mean, putting that firmly to one side for the moment. And then I feel like we saw, of course, last cycle saw record applicants. Although I would perhaps argue that, we've been seeing record applicants kind of cycle on cycle for a number of years now anyway. And, people saying, yeah, it's the Fauci effect. We've pushed epidemiology and healthcare delivery to the forefronts of everyone's mind. So they're going to be applying to medical school. Yeah. And I think that's a very powerful idea, which once you put it into somebody's mind, it becomes very easy to spread. And it almost became perhaps almost like a meme within certain pre-med circles. I don't know about you, Ryan. I didn't find this concept very compelling, right? I mean, I'm sure everyone that's listening today knows the kind of very deliberate, very long-term, very goal-directed actions that applying to medical school requires. Yeah. It's not something that, come March,
I rolled out of bed one day.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I should do this medicine thing. I guess I'll just apply next month.
Yeah. The fast food worker was like, you know what? Since this pandemic, I think I want to go to medical school, so I'm going to apply this cycle and see what happens. Yeah. That's what all of the media made it out to be, is like all this random people just all of a sudden was like, I'm going to apply to medical school, and it's because of Dr. Fauci. And we all know that doesn't happen. Right. And so I think one of the questions that comes from everything that has happened around the application cycle from 2020 to 2021 and now 2021, 2022, the one that you're currently in, is especially students applying in 2022 to start medical school in 2023, is the application cycle going to be harder? Is it going to be more competitive? Are there going to be more people that are applying? And so to really look forward to next cycle, which is where I want to go, we have to look back a little bit and really talk about this Fauci effect and go, was there anything to it? Now, my assumption is, and I was just pulling up an NPR article about it, that the AAMC, of course, they make all of the money when more people apply to medical school. So, of course, they're really excited about trying to promote more people want to go to medical school because they get more money, right? It is super, super jaded on their front. And so I think the number is 18% more applicants, right? More applicants, not applications, because each applicant can obviously increase the number of applications they are submitting. But they're saying 18% more applicants. And so again, who are these people? And they don't really tell us, right? They don't say these applicants were grocery store workers and didn't want to be frontline grocery store workers. They wanted to be frontline doctors now. And they were English majors yesterday, and now all of a sudden they're applying to medical school with no prereqs, right? And no MCAT score to tie it into the MCAT podcast. Where I personally think most, if not all of these applicants came from were students who are planning on applying in 2021, but heard that, there are some schools thinking about dropping the MCAT requirement. I'm going to put in my application now because I basically have everything else. I was just waiting on taking the MCAT, but I'm just going to try because, hey, I'm a bad test taker and I have test anxiety and I know I'm not going to do great on the MCAT. So I'm going to be able to get into Stanford because Stanford has said that the MCAT is optional this year.
Yeah. Absolutely. Or the one that stood out to me was perhaps people who perhaps would have applied 2 years from now that have pulled it forward because they happen to have a lot of time sitting at home. And, ultimately applying to medical school does take a lot of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. Stanford, their data, according to this NPR article, is they saw a 50% jump in the number of applications. I'm like, yeah, because you said the MCAT was optional, right? Stanford was one of the first big names out there that said, we're going to make the MCAT optional. And I think they're doing it this year as well, 2021 to 2022. Yeah. And so, of course, they're going to see more applications, more applicants, because they made it optional. And I think that's where all of these people came from. These weren't people that just woke up one day and go, I want to go to medical school, right? We know, we've seen when we have recessions and depressions and traumatic stuff like 9/11, people always go back to education They fall back on education to help propel them forward in life through tough times. And so I think in a couple years, we will very likely see a more natural increase in applications and applicants who were doing something else and then decided to go back to undergrad or go get their prereqs or whatever that looks like, and then they're going to apply to medical school.
Yes,
So,
absolutely. I think, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see the return of the Fauci effect article, 3 years from now, when perhaps all the people who were inspired, have now kind of brought themselves to the position where they are able to apply.
Yeah. So from an MCAT perspective, right? We're the MCAT podcast. From an MCAT perspective, for those applying in 2022 or out into the future, and there's still a random Stanford or a random school out there that's like, oh yeah, the MCAT's optional. What is the word on the street in terms of, should I take the MCAT or should I just apply to these 1 or 2 or 3 schools that the MCAT is optional?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting and a really nuanced question that, of course, entirely depends on your particular background. In general, you should take the MCAT to apply to medical school. While there are some schools which have gone MCAT optional, or indeed, I believe the UC system have mostly, if not entirely, gone MCAT blind, which is, of course, a step beyond MCAT optional. And kind of the interesting thing about that is that, yes, now for the first time in a long time, you can go to medical school without having taken the MCAT, without being in, for example, a special, say, combined bachelor's MD program that doesn't require it. This said, for the vast majority of applicants, taking the MCAT is the right decision. And, I know that's really easy for me to say, like, oh yeah, person who works at an MCAT prep company says you should take the MCAT. But, allow me to make the case. The average, like Ryan, like when a student comes up to you and says, how many medical schools should I apply to this cycle? What number do you normally give them?
I don't give them a number. I'm like, it's the average is 17, right? The AAMC says the average is 17 for MD schools. The average for DO schools is 9, I believe. And so the answer is, how big is your wallet? And how much time do you have to write secondaries? Because that's a big factor as well.
Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, like, for most people, you should be casting your MD, and DO net fairly wide, right? Yep. Because medical school admissions is hard. Yep. It's really hard to go to medical school. And ultimately, you want to maximize your chances of becoming a physician.
Yep.
To do that, there are not, for example, 20 MCAT optional schools in the country.
Yeah.
To put yourself on the kind of statistical level that you really want to be, so that you don't have to reapply, so that you don't have to go back and study for the take out time to study for the MCAT, you should be taking the MCAT. And and ultimately, for the vast majority of people, if you approach the MCAT in a structured way, in a careful way, and take all of the steps that you need to do, the kind of score that you need to become a physician is not out of reach.
Yeah. Factor in for the people out there who are like, well, I have a 4.0 GPA. And so there may be the Stanford out there or whatever school. They're going to look at my 4.0 GPA and they're going to really love that. I'm really scared about the MCAT. And so I would much rather apply without the MCAT with my 4.0 GPA and just see what happens.
Yeah. I think particularly for schools like Stanford, Stanford's average matriculant MCAT score is very high. It's, north of the 98th percentile. It's very high. And, with that in mind, I think there's an interesting point to Stanford, going MCAT optional, because in the sense that basically all of the students that they accept that don't submit an MCAT are probably the types of students who, weren't able to take the MCAT for, you know, really serious personal mitigating circumstance reasons. But, you know, who probably, if they had taken it, would have done very well. I think it's really easy to often perhaps read in more to these kinds of decisions than perhaps they actually signal. And that ultimately, you know, getting into Stanford is really, really hard. And, you know, you can't pin all of your hopes on Stanford, right?
Yeah, that's true. So we saw the AAMC.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
Like one more point on that as well, which is that the MCAT is really hard. The MCAT is really scary. You know,
no, it's
everyone
important.
Listening. I promise both Ryan and I understand that.
Yeah.
But, you know, like, Ryan, you're a doctor. Medical school also has a lot of high stakes standardized examinations.
Yeah. It does. So when the pandemic started, and obviously there were lots of lockdowns and stay-at-home orders and all of this stuff, the AAMC very much drew a line in the sand and said, we will not create a virtual test. Obviously, the test is virtual. You just have to go to a testing center, but they wouldn't allow students to take it on their own computers, log into a website, have a virtual proctor, etc. The AAMC, for some reason, counter to every other major, as far as I know, every other major test creator out there has said that the MCAT can't do that. And do you see that changing at all in the future as we continue through Delta and Lambda and Mu and all of the new variants that are going to come in the next couple of years?
It's of course, the AAMC very often is a black box in terms of the actions that they take, in the sense that, it can be very difficult to gain any kind of insight as to what's happening on the inside. I mean, barring truly exceptional circumstances, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. They've made it known.
Yeah, and and if there was ever a time where it was going to happen, it would have been last year.
Yeah.
If there's the spread of a variant, which, let's all hope collectively that this doesn't happen. If a variant spreads, which is, an order of magnitude more of a public health crisis than the ones we're dealing with now, then, perhaps they would revisit this issue. I think the probability is vanishingly small.
Yeah. This came up very early on when I was first looking at this and why the AAMC hasn't done it. There was a big call for them to do this in 2017, I believe the year was. There was a major hurricane that hit Puerto Rico, and the island was devastated, and the testing centers were closed. And so you had a whole island that's like, we want to take the MCAT, right? Puerto Rico has medical schools, U.S. medical schools on the island, and they take a lot of their students from their island, and it's students who couldn't take the MCAT. They had to fly to the mainland if they could get out to take the MCAT, and people are like, AAMC, like, let them take it online at home if they have power and internet. And there was a huge push back then, and then obviously 2020 rolls around, and there's still crickets from the AAMC, unfortunately. So the MCAT also changed in length from this 7.5 hour test to a 5 hour test or whatever it changed to fit more people in the testing centers and have 3 tests a day instead of the 1 test a day it was previously, and now 2 tests a day that it is now. Do you see the AAMC changing the format of the test again to accommodate anything?
The AAMC, their entire job is to provide a standardized testing experience. I think last year was a, unprecedented anomaly. They've returned to the standard testing length. I don't think would see them shorten it again. I think in their minds they've appropriately addressed those kinds of concerns by shifting the test timing. So of course now you can take it at 2 times. You can take it at 7:30 in the morning, or you can take it at 3 p.m. which I often say to my students. They're kind of they both involve trade-offs, just in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
I've talked to a lot of students who really want that morning spot, and other students who really want that afternoon spot, just based on their own kind of circadian rhythm and sleep patterns.
Oh yeah. No, if I were booking my test, I'd be like, give me the 3 p.m. I am perfectly fine with finishing at 10:30 at night. Like,
yeah, that works.
Yeah.
So
I think to the AMC, they feel like they have adequately addressed criticism regarding test provisioning, and I think although to many people that may be disappointing, but that's where we are.
Especially the people who are needing to travel 5-6 hours or flying somewhere to be able to take the exam because their local testing center is closed or is full or what have you. And I'm in the middle of reading a book called Why We Sleep, and reading that book, I'm like, one thing I want to talk about from now on is if you can prevent at all costs needing to travel for the MCAT, do it. The book talks about research about sleeping in hotel rooms, and our body, right? Our body is built to protect us, and it knows that you're in a new sleeping environment, and it will not let you get into as deep of a sleep as you normally would at home if you're sleeping in a hotel room. Because it's like, this is a new cave I'm sleeping in. I don't know if bears or hyenas or saber-toothed tigers come around this way. And you don't sleep as well. On top of the normal test anxiety that you would have, potentially preventing you from sleeping well, you have your own body's kind of built-in protection mechanisms not letting you sleep as well. And so I'm now kind of screaming from the rooftops, like, don't travel to take the MCAT because it's just not good.
I will send, and we can trim this out of the podcast if it doesn't fit, but I will send you an article. That book has actually come under quite a lot of scientific criticism.
Really? Oh, cool.
For being overzealous with its representation of the data.
Nice.
Like it's interesting. It's come up. The author is an English guy, actually based at Berkeley, I believe, and that book has been subject to some quite heavy criticism.
Nice. I like it. We'll leave that in because that's some the good stuff, right? That's called science, right? You read something and something gets put out, and then other people are like, wait a minute. So good, glad to know that's out there. All right. So one of the other big changes, you mentioned it already a little bit in terms of shadowing and clinical experience and that being affected. What are your thoughts from what you've seen? Again, through your own application cycle, how do you think admissions committees are going to be dealing with students coming in with less clinical experience, less shadowing, less whatever because of all of the shutdowns and everything?
Yeah, in fact, I think this ties into one of the things I love so much about this very podcast is that kind of you have stressed repeatedly over many, many years and, have had and have you have interviewed admissions committee members or deans of admissions at medical schools, and I think it's always worth emphasizing, right, that this is not an algorithm which decides the med school class, right? Everyone who makes these admissions calls and decisions, they are real people. They are real people who want to build like the best possible medical school, like a matriculated class that they possibly can. And they do that explicitly by considering students, not numbers. And, I think it's really easy to kind of lose sight of that when you're applying, because I think at points it can feel quite impersonal. But ultimately, this is a situation that absolutely everyone applying has gone through. I promise, every single admissions committee member in every single medical school in the country will be aware of this because it affects everyone, including them personally.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a very frustrating question that I get that completely in my mind lacks self-awareness and understanding that there are other people out in the world besides you. When students are like, well, because of the pandemic, I didn't get a lot of shadowing. I'm like, do you think you're the only student out there that this affected? Like, if you are, we have some major problems. And so, right, if you want to ask that question, ask, right? Obviously, because of the pandemic, shadowing was really affected for every student. Like, how do you think it's going to be looked at? But so many students are like, well, this just affected me, and I don't know what to do now. And it's just super frustrating. So another resource I just want to plug for a second is Inside Med Admissions. If you go to our Mapped YouTube channel, mapped.tv, we have the first episode of Inside Med Admissions is Dr. Scott Wright, former director of admissions at UT Southwestern, interviewing 3 other directors of admissions about COVID and its impact. And we were talking specifically about the 2020 to 2021 application cycle, but I think it was that application cycle. It might be the 2021, 2022. No, it is 2022. 2021, 2022, so many numbers, application cycle. And as you said, right, they are aware because the medical schools themselves had to deal with this problem at the beginning too of our medical students going to be able to get the rotations that they need, or are they going to be blocked from going into the hospital because it's only going to be the essential people needed to take care of patients, and medical students potentially aren't on that list. So medical schools had to deal with it, and obviously the directors of admissions are aware of the problem and are adjusting.
Yeah, don't worry, medical schools did have to deal with the most pressing public health crisis in a century.
Yeah. They understand. So if
to plug an earlier episode, I would highly recommend that everyone listening here go back and listen to your interview with Dean Rivera, the head of admissions at NYU.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's the MCAT podcast or if it was the
pre-med years. Yeah.
And I think that was relatively that was like kind of
that was very early on.
Yeah. And I think he did a really great, of course, and I had the pleasure to kind of end up to speak with him personally a bit after that.
Yeah.
And I mean, of course they're aware. How could they not be?
Yeah. Yeah. Raphael, he's a good friend. I love having him on the podcast and getting to pick his brain. So really what it comes down to is as students are really worried about the changes that are coming in terms of are there going to be more students applying? Is it going to be more competitive? How are medical schools going to view this? Do they know that things are difficult for us? The answer is applying to medical school has always been hard. It will always be hard. I think we both kind of agree that the 2020 bump, this quote unquote Fauci effect, were mostly very rushed applications of people trying to take advantage of a lack of MCAT that ultimately didn't pan out, I think, as many people hoped it would. And so that was just a lot of extra revenue for the AAMC and maybe secondary essay revenue for medical schools. And most of those students didn't get into medical school and are just going to need to reapply to medical school. And so it's not going to be more competitive. It's just going to be the way it is, right? People still need to do well in their classes and still need to do well in their MCAT and everything else. I think the potential silver lining is for those students who have always had a hard time finding shadowing, finding clinical experience, those coming from minority or disadvantaged backgrounds who don't have mommy or daddy as doctors or don't have all of their neighbors as doctors because they live in nicer neighborhoods, is the fact that medical schools may lower a lot of what they've been looking for and may look holistically, I hate that buzzword, may look more holistically at everything and really question, do we really need to have a filter of you have to have 40 hours of shadowing experience in 3 different specialties? So I think there's a silver lining for some people out there.
And by the way, I often think the biggest silver lining, at least in terms of financial savings, is remote interviews.
Oh, huge.
Like, to the tune of sometimes for people, if you're a low income but very strong applicant, if you're the kind of applicant who, and some people do, it's not enormously common, but some people, go into a cycle and get 10 interviews.
Yeah.
and that's that is a crushing financial burden.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's really difficult to look at an interview invite when they're saying like, when you don't have an offer of admission yet, and to say, no, sorry, I can't come.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's one of the biggest silver linings, and I think that's something that's here to stay. I've talked to a lot of people, and they really like virtual interviews because it allows them more flexibility from an interviewer standpoint, more flexibility with their own schedule. They don't have to be somewhere specific, and so they can fit interviews into their maybe clinic schedule or operating schedule easier. And the financial benefits for students not needing to fly, have hotel accommodations, as well as the opportunity cost of missing work. Obviously, you still need to miss work on your interview day, but maybe the day before and day after you won't have to miss because you're home doing the interview. So that's a huge change that I think a lot of schools will keep some option for virtual interviews. And then the question will come from students is, if they give me the option of in-person and virtual, will they think I'm less committed if I do virtual? And that's just a question, unfortunately, that we'll have to see how that plays out.
I know. I really hope that for the students, for the schools that retain a virtual interview, that it's either like we'll randomly assign it, or it's done in some way that like is carefully constructed to minimize biases, right? Because I think it's possibly really easy, even if you don't explicitly consider it as part of your admissions criteria, right? I think it's really easy, for example, for even on an implicit bias level, right? That like, I saw this person in person, and therefore there's just a part of my brain that likes them more and thinks they would be a better fit in our class.
Yeah. I had more oxytocin release and dopamine release when they were in my presence. Therefore, I have a stronger attachment to them. It all comes down to science.
This applicant was taller than I expected, and this one was just on Zoom.
Yeah. Oh, man. So many things to think about. So ultimately for the student, and we'll wrap up here, ultimately for the student, I think there are a lot of questions that are unanswered. There's a lot of what ifs out there that you have no control over. And so in my mind, it's just useless to even worry about it, right? Yeah, understand that there's a lot of this and that and what ifs and whatever, right? Focus on what you can do, what will help you stand out from an application standpoint. Grades, MCAT score, clinical experience, shadowing, all that normal stuff, and then telling your story and your personal statement and interviews and stuff like that. And then just keep pushing forward and don't stress the small things and worry about how each individual medical school is going to handle lack of shadowing and lack of clinical experience, etc. So
I like to frame it as I think which really helped me when I was approaching this was I liked to frame this as, I think it's really easy to think of this process adversarially. I'm trying to fashion my body into a triangle-shaped projectile to fit through the triangle-shaped hole that medical school X has fashioned for me that I need to, they'll let me in resentfully. And I think it's really, I think when you reverse the perspective, when you think about like being on an admissions committee, medical schools ultimately really want you to apply there. And of course, not just for secondary revenue, they really want, more than anything, it's their job. They want to fill their medical school class with kind of engaged and interesting and passionate people. They want to fill their classes with kind of the best, with the best possible people that they can find. You are making yourself available for them to choose, right? They are, ultimately, I think when mentally reframed, you can see it's easier to see it perhaps as like a win-win. And in that case, to see a rejection as a, like, it's not that I'm a bad or a terrible person. It's just that, maybe I wasn't the perfect fit with this school.
Yeah. So for students, what can they be doing today to start preparing for their 2022 application?
The first point I always suggest is if you haven't taken your MCAT yet and you're planning to take it in January, there is a very valuable link that I give to all of my students who are in this situation, which is if you go onto the AAMC website, there is an email mailing list alert that will email you as soon as booking dates are, like the day that you can book your test is announced, and then the day that it opens. In that, this is, meaningful post-COVID in the sense that, of course, booking MCAT dates, depending on where you live, has always been difficult. I got burned by that personally when I was first studying. I went to go book my test 6 weeks in advance and was like, oh, wait a minute. Oh, they're all booked out. Oh, within 600 miles. Oh, guess I'm not taking it this summer. And get on that mailing list. Fill out the link. Put in your email address, be notified. For January test dates, they're going to they will clarify details by mid-September, so hopefully in the next couple of weeks at time of recording, and that they will open bookings in approximately mid-October. Yeah. Follow the AAMC MCAT account on Twitter. If you don't have Twitter, download it, make an account just for this purpose, and set up basically notifications on your phone so that, coming up to the day, whenever that Twitter account tweets, it sends you the equivalent of a text message.
Yeah. That was actually something that I think I liked them doing last year, or not last year, but the last time registration opened for the MCAT, is they changed, because historically the AAMC is just horrendous at their IT infrastructure, and their websites are constantly crashing, and they get overwhelmed very easily. And they know lots of students are trying to register for the MCAT at one time, right? And so this past year, they have done MCAT registration across 2 days to basically say, and I don't know if this is the exact line, but anything east of the Mississippi River is you're registering on test day 1 or on day 1, and anything west of the Mississippi, you're registering on the second day, so that they're splitting their volume of people coming to the website in half, which I think is a great idea, and something I applaud the AAMC for actually doing and trying something different for once.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of this isn't, and they also implemented a waitlist system, I believe, for the first time. And yeah, I mean, all of this is in service, right, of ultimately they have a lot of demand for people taking their tests, right, and they have to allocate it somehow.
Yeah.
In terms of what best to do for this cycle, what I think is really interesting about this cycle in particular is, in a lot of ways, on the specifics of what you should be doing, how little it actually varies from a typical cycle, right? Mm-hmm. Remember, COVID is a huge bump. Of course it is. But ultimately, the qualities that medical schools are looking for in prospective medical students are the same as ever. They want people who are committed. They want people who are compassionate. They want people who, have the fire within them to pursue a career which is very difficult, but that ultimately ultimately is very meaningful. All of the qualities that they are kind of trying to select by remain the same, which means actually a lot of the conventional advice applies. Get experience in healthcare if you possibly can. And, Ryan, I know you've done a lot of work with, helping people secure remote shadowing.
Yep. eShadowing.com.
Yeah. Study for your MCAT and do as well on it as you can, because that's a valuable point of data for medical schools. Keep focusing on your grades. Many schools have started to go back to in-person classes, but either way, don't keep your GPA at your level of potential.
Yeah.
these are all the same, selection criteria that have been true for years and years and years. And ultimately this cycle, for all of its quirks, is mostly no different.
Yeah. It will work out. Do all the things that will help you as an applicant. Don't try to stand out. Just tell your story, get the experiences, and ultimately you'll be successful. As you will be, Alex. Fingers crossed that everything works well for you this cycle.
Yeah, try not to stand out. I think I kind of fell on that hurdle, but oh well.
That's okay. Alex, if people want to get some of your brilliant MCAT advice, you are a live online instructor with Blueprint MCAT. How can students find out more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go to Blueprint MCAT, you can sign up. You can sign up for the live online course. It's a 16 lesson series of 2.5 hours each, where we kind of really dive into, not just the MCAT itself, but your approach to it, right? I think the interesting thing, and the live course at Blueprint is actually relatively new, but what I really like about it is that I think it's really easy to approach the MCAT thinking that it's just a test of content, right? And of course, that's something that that's a conception, right? That we've you've kind of debunked, ad nauseum on this very podcast. But ultimately, I think it's really difficult, right, as someone studying for the MCAT to say, well, how do I improve on strategy? I can read about the electron transport chain, but how do I approach questions strategically? That's a very difficult skill to learn, I think, sitting by yourself looking at a biochemistry textbook. Which is why the live course really is, it's two instructors who just go through MCAT content, like we would and like we did on test day, which is, here's the content that you need to answer this question. But ultimately, this is also, your opportunity to get 30 plus hours of listening to, two instructors say, well, as someone who did well on this test, here's how I would approach this question. Here's how I would deduce that A was the correct answer, even if I didn't remember any of the underlying content. And, there are even a few questions from the course which I think take that to the extreme, which I think is just, and certainly for someone like me when I was studying for the MCAT, I think, this experience would have just been like gold dust. Like, oh my goodness, I didn't even realize that was logically possible.
Yeah. BlueprintMCAT.com. Go check it out and check out that live online course. Alex, thanks for coming and sharing your thoughts on COVID and the application cycle and what's to come, hopefully, or not hopefully, maybe in 2022.
We can hope it'll all work out in the end.